Good day to you. When you go into a bank, one of the things that strikes you right away is you are confronted with a big marble counter. And behind that counter is a teller. And the teller may be behind glass. And behind that teller are all kinds of paintings and other kinds of things that are designed to get you to feel, to be invited, that this is a safe place, starting with that marble counter, that everything appears to be tranquil about a bank. It appears to be in order. You don't hear a lot of chaos inside of a bank. In a way, the way that a bank is constructed, the average bank, it's rhetorical. It's inviting you, by the way that it's set up, to believe that your money is safe. And that very same principle is how we're approaching the next chapter in media criticism, which is rhetorical analysis. It's rhetorical criticism, as some of us might call it. It's the idea that media are persuading us all the time, not just overtly, not just in terms of a campaign speech that you see or an advertisement or a person who comes on with a public service announcement, not just that kind of overt persuasion, but the very act of watching and listening and observing in and of itself we are being persuaded by media to do. And so when you are watching a sitcom, for example, on television, and all of a sudden the applause erupts and you feel forced to laugh, that's a kind of strong rhetoric that's taking place. The applause has been put into the show as a sound effect, and it kind of lifts you up like a wave and gets you to kind of laugh along with the show as well. Applause. I say soundtrack is what I mean, the laugh track. That's what I'm trying to say. So media are trying to persuade us all the time. That's what rhetorical criticism is all about. And it's not new rhetorical criticism. This chapter develops some very heavy thinking. It starts with ancient Greece and goes on up through some modern French philosophers. But let's give a nod to ancient Greece, where Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and many other Greeks first began to study rhetoric. They began to study rhetoric as the use of symbols to influence other human beings. When you're driving your car and you honk, you're trying to influence the person in front of you to get out of your way. And so that's what symbols are all about. It's how do they invite human beings to respond? That's what we're looking at when we're studying rhetoric. And at the core of a rhetorical criticism analysis is the sign. The sign invites the audience to think about something there's agreed upon meaning. If I leave the room and you're wondering, okay, is there going to be class today? And I come back into the room and I give you a thumbs up like this, it's an agreed upon sign that yes, there's going to be class today. You have already understood, based on our pre-existing assumptions about what that particular sign means in our culture, that you've already understood what it means. And so this is the basis of rhetorical criticism, is to look for signs in media, as you will be doing for your discussion question today, signs in media that trigger an invitation. Now let's cover some of the major thinkers that contributed to rhetorical criticism, starting with Ferdinand de Saussure, a French person, a French academic, de Saussure. He was from 1857 to 1913. He was a Swiss linguist. He spoke French, but he was a Swiss linguist. And he developed an approach to studying media later on that was based in the study of linguistics, which is the study of language. And when he looked at language, his branch of study was called semiology, which is the science of studying language. And the two elements of studying language is the signifier and the signified. And the signifier is the material form of a sign as is perceived by the senses. And so the word dog, for example, is a material form of a sign that's perceived by the senses. We can look at that D-O-G and we can see that as a sign that we perceive through our eyes. But then there's also a mental concept, and that is the kinds of emotions that are signified along with that signifier. So the emotions that might come out with thinking about a dog depend on whether you've ever been bit by a dog, or whether you're afraid of dogs, or whether you like dogs, or whether you have a rescue dog, or whether you have had a dog in your family. And then you might be afraid of dogs, or you might love dogs, or you might have no reaction to dogs. And so that's what goes along with the signifier. It's the signified. It's that mental concept. So you can read more about Ferdinand Saussure in the chapter. And now we're going to go on to Charles Sanders Peirce. Charles Sanders Peirce, who's an American, he's a Harvard philosopher, and he was also studying semiotics. He's studying semiotics, and he said, I don't like the way that it's been studied so far. It's too arbitrary. So instead, I think we need to develop that there's more of a discrete connection between communication that takes place and the way that we're going to analyze it. So he said there is a triad of relations, and this will take away some of the arbitrariness. There's a triad, so you have a sign, that's something that stands for something else to someone, and then you have an object, which is the thing, and then you have the interpretant, which is the meaning. So that triangle is like this. We have the sign. This is what looks like a bottle, and it is a bottle, but it also has a slender shape to it, made for gripping, but also could be interpreted as a female shape. Some might interpret it as a female shape. Certainly Coke does, and they have a similar look to it. So you have a sign. Then you have the thing, which is the bottle itself. So we have the name, which is bottle, and we have the bottle itself, which is a sign, and then the interpretant, which is, we can say it has a, perhaps you could say it has a female shape to it, or at least a slender shape to it. So the sign is the word, the bottle is the object, is the thing, and then the interpretant is how we interpret it. That's what Charles Sanders Peirce says. And he says there are three kinds of signs. Furthermore, you've got icons, you've got indexical signs, and you've got symbols. Those are three kinds of signs that you can read about in the chapter. Next up is the French author, the French philosopher rather, Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes, he's living from 1915 to 1980. He's the most important French philosopher after World War II, and he talked about studying myth, and that's how cultural practices and beliefs are naturalized, how they are naturalized. So, for example, there's this whole concept of syllabus week at East Stroudsburg University. And it's a terrible thing for professors to hear that syllabus week, because it naturalizes the idea that you're not going to do anything supposedly during the first week of class, which is just not true. Syllabus week is a way of naturalizing. It's a myth that's built into our culture. And Roland Barthes talked about how myths can have two dimensions to them. You can have a denotative myth and a connotative myth. Those are the two kinds. A denotative myth is the literal meaning. So you can say the word chair has a literal meaning of 4 legs and a seat that you sit on. That may be what the dictionary definition actually says. There's a literal meaning to it. But then there's also a connotative meaning, and that's the myth and the ideology that surrounds a chair. So a chair could be associated with the idea that when you're sitting in a chair, you are subservient to the person who's standing up, who's standing in front of you, because they get to stand up while you get to sit. At least that's the case in classes, right? That's why the professor is the person doing the standing up. So that sums up Barthes. And now we're going to go on now to texts and rhetorical structures. Text and rhetorical structures. We're going to take a look at how do we analyze texts. And when we use that word text from now and until the rest of class, we are talking not about a textbook, and we're not talking about texting on a phone. We're talking about the content that we are studying media-wise. That's what we're going to refer to as our text. We also use that word text to refer to our readings for the class, so please don't get too confused by that. It depends on the context that we're using the term, but text from now on is that content, that media content that we're going to analyze. And so one of the ways of analyzing text is to look at clusters of meanings. Clusters are individual signs that are associated with and differentiated with other signs. And so we can say, for example, if we look at country music in the media, it's just country music in general, we can say that there are certain attributes about the people who listen to country music which will allow us to say that there's a cluster of this audience. So those people might be, for example, patriotic Americans. They're not people, generally speaking, who are going to be, for example, voting for Bernie Sanders if they're listening to country music, because they are patriotic Americans. They might, for example, be into NASCAR more than they would be into golf. They may, for example, be more white people than African Americans or Latino people. We're generalizing here, but what we're doing is we're saying there are clusters that are associated with texts, in this case, country music, that we can say are an example of how we can use rhetorical criticism to bring out the meaning of the people who are watching and listening to country music. And so that's one way of looking at rhetorical text. Now we're going to look at the next way, and that's to look at the form of the text. And there's a very famous rhetorical thinker here named Kenneth Burke, and he is the one that says that we can look at form. And form is the arousing and fulfillment of desires. And so in television, for example, and on YouTube increasingly, you'll be watching something and all of a sudden, hold on, you have to stop what you're watching because there's an advertisement that's popping up and that's inserted there. Even for something as necessary as the weather on YouTube. Hey, you wait till you hear what's coming our way this weekend. Oh, right after this break. Well, wait a minute. No, we want to hear what's coming up this weekend right now. Is it a storm? Is it something that's threatening our safety? Is it going to be a big snowstorm? No, why do we have to wait? That's what Kenneth Burke is looking at, how the form can offer a teasing that goes on. It's an arousing and fulfillment of desires. And television can have a very linear form like that, right? You have to wait. You can't skip past the TV ads. You have to wait for them to be done before you get back. There's different forms. There's progressive form, there's repetitive form, there's conventional form. You can read about it. Yet another way of looking at text from a rhetorical standpoint is to look at the genre of text. And so we can say that certain genres of media have an inductive reasoning and certain genres have a deductive reasoning. So an inductive reasoning is where each individual unit builds up and then we see a pattern. So if you watch Shameless, for example, on television, each particular show starts to build a case that each person in that household in Shameless has some kind of really crazy, almost debilitating personality flaw. It could be drinking, it could be bipolarism. You see that from each individual episode and then you reach an overall conclusion. That's what happens in a genre. Versus a deductive form of reasoning, which is where everything is laid out in front of you and then the show gets on, or the content gets on with developing the content. So if you watch ESPN Sports, for example, it's all about sports. And you know that from starting it. You're not going to see anything having to do with house hunting. You're not going to see anything having to do with eating unless it's related to sports. So that's laying it out from the beginning, and now each of those individual show afterwards is going to support what's already laid out. Now we're going to take a look finally at aesthetics, another dimension of rhetoric. Rhetoric is not all about how media messages persuade. It is also about how media messages persuade us to see the beauty of media content. We're going to look to the French philosopher Descartes, Rene Descartes here, and he has a quote on page 125 that's relevant here. He says, "A person is not a mind and a body. They're not a mind and a body. There are not two things somehow mysteriously yoked together. What we call a person is a certain kind of bodily organism that has a brain operating with its body, a body that is continually interacting with aspects of its environments in an ever-changing process of experience." So we cannot separate both. We have to look at mind as body together, and we can look at the aesthetics of media as one way of touching both those sides to us. We can look at the aesthetics of media content in terms of the color, the lighting, the editing, the movement, and framing and sound. I mean, you've listened to music that you think is beautiful. You've watched a film that you thought is beautiful. You can watch a beautiful television performance. You can look at a website and you can say that that is beautiful. There's an aesthetic behind certain media, behind media that invites us to appreciate the beauty of media, and that's also an important part of rhetorical analysis. So there you have it. There's our chapter today on rhetorical analysis. You'll be applying this perspective in your question response, and then we'll be moving on to the next perspective tomorrow. Have a great day.